Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we would be discussing about the remaining part of the anterior triangle. That is, in the previous video, we had discussed about the submental triangle and the digastric triangle. Today, we'll be discussing about the carotid triangle and the muscular triangle in detail. So, the boundaries of the carotid triangle. In this figure, this green color is for the digastric muscle. This is the anterior belly of the digastric. This is the posterior belly of the digastric. In yellow is the stylohyoid muscle. In blue is the omohyoid muscle. This is the superior belly of omohyoid. This is inferior belly of omohyoid. This muscle in white is the sternocleidomastoid. The red outline is for the carotid triangle. So the boundaries are: the anterior superior boundary is formed by the posterior belly of digastric and stylohyoid muscle. Anterior inferior boundary is formed by the superior belly of the omohyoid muscle, and the posterior boundary is formed by the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Roof of the carotid triangle is more or less very much similar to the roof of the digastric triangle with just slight changes. वहाँ भी रूफ जो है कंटेन करती थी स्किन, सुपरफिशियल फेशिया एंड डीप फेशिया. Roof of the carotid triangle also contains skin, then superficial fascia, then deep fascia. Superficial fascia of both the digastric and the carotid triangle contain platysma muscle and the cervical branch of the facial nerve. So this is common in digastric and carotid triangle, the roof. Difference is the roof of digastric was containing the anterior cutaneous nerve of the neck, and the roof of the carotid triangle contains transverse cutaneous nerve. And again, the deep fascia is formed by the investing layer. वहाँ पे जो deep fascia था, it was splitting to enclose the submandibular salivary gland. But इस triangle में there is no salivary gland present, so there is no splitting of the investing layer. Floor, again, because it is a in any triangle, the floor is formed by muscles. So here also the middle constrictor muscle of the pharynx and the inferior constrictor muscle of the pharynx, and also the thyrohyoid membrane. These three part of these three structures is forming the floor of this carotid triangle. This is the carotid triangle. The sternocleidomastoid has been pulled. It has been pulled to show this carotid triangle. Now the contents of the carotid triangle. As the name suggests, because it is a carotid triangle, so it contains the carotid artery. It contains the common carotid artery. It contains the carotid sinus, carotid body. It contains the internal carotid artery, and it contains the external carotid artery. And in this figure, you can see all the branches of the external carotid artery, and you can remember the branches of the external carotid artery with the help of a mnemonic, that is, some anatomist like freaking out poor medical students. That is the mnemonic for memorizing the branches of the external carotid. So the branches that are part of the carotid triangle are superior thyroid, lingual, facial, ascending pharyngeal, and occipital. So there are total 8 branches, and out of 8, 5, these 5 are part of the carotid triangle. So some anatomists like freaking out. These branches are the part of the carotid triangle. Internal carotid is much deeper, and you can see here, this is first the common carotid. This swelled up portion is the carotid sinus, and then it divides into the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. So these are the contents of the carotid triangle. Other contents of the carotid triangle include veins, that is the common facial vein, the pharyngeal vein, and the lingual vein, all drain into the internal jugular vein. Nerves, the important nerve is the vagus nerve. It runs vertically downwards and it gives the superior laryngeal branch, which divides into external laryngeal and internal laryngeal nerve respectively. You can see here in the figure, you have this is the common carotid. So common carotid जहाँ पे split होती है into the internal carotid and the external carotid, वहाँ वो थोड़ी सी swelled up हो जाती है, तो that portion is carotid sinus. So the common carotid artery, the carotid sinus, then it divides into internal carotid, external carotid, then the branches of the external carotid. All are the contents of the carotid triangle. And this is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs vertically downwards. It is coming downwards and it gives the superior laryngeal nerve, and that gives finally the external and the internal laryngeal nerves. Same you can see here in the figure as well. All these form the contents of the carotid triangle. That is the common carotid, then the carotid sinus, then the external carotid, internal carotid, branches of the external carotid, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve goes vertically downwards and gives the superior laryngeal. Superior laryngeal further divides into external and internal laryngeal. Also the spinal accessory nerve. Spinal accessory nerve runs downwards over the internal jugular vein. And also the hypoglossal nerve runs forwards over the external and internal carotid. And also other contents are the deep cervical lymph nodes that are situated along this internal jugular vein. Spinal accessory, hypoglossal, vagus, these are three nerves. Lymph nodes are the deep cervical, and deep cervical lymph nodes include two group of lymph nodes, that is jugulo-digastric nodes below the posterior belly of the digastric and jugulo-omohyoid above the inferior belly of the omohyoid. That is why they get their name. They are situated along the internal jugular vein. That is why they are named as jugulo-digastric, because they are related to internal jugular and the posterior belly of digastric, and jugulo-omohyoid because internal jugular vein and the inferior belly of the omohyoid. So you can see here, these are the two group of deep cervical lymph nodes, that is jugulo-digastric. This is the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, and they lie below this posterior belly. They are jugulo-digastric, and they're situated along, this is the internal jugular vein. In blue, this is the internal jugular vein. These deep cervical nodes, they lie along these internal jugular vein. And this is the jugulo-omohyoid, that is above. This is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle, so it lies above this muscle. So that's all about the carotid triangle. Now we'll discuss about the muscular triangle. So muscular triangle का जो name है वो suggest करता है that this triangle is formed by muscles and this triangle contains muscle. So इस muscle का जो content है, इस muscle का जो floor है, that is formed by group of muscles, and the muscles commonly are known as the infrahyoid group of muscles. So the boundaries of the muscular triangle: anteriorly it is formed by the anterior median line of the neck, which runs from the hyoid bone. This is the hyoid bone and this is the sternum. So this is the anterior boundary. The posterior superior boundary, this is posterior superior boundary formed by the superior belly of the omohyoid, and the posterior inferior boundary is formed by the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. So anterior boundary, posterior superior boundary, posterior inferior boundary. So this is the muscular triangle. So the contents of the muscular triangle, because it is a muscular triangle, it contains muscles and the floor is also formed by muscle, and the group of muscle is infrahyoid muscle. So the first muscle is the sternohyoid. So जैसा नाम suggest करता है, it goes from the sternum to the hyoid bone. So origin is from the manubrium sterni and insertion is into the hyoid bone. Nerve supply is by the Ansa cervicalis. It is a nerve loop. We will discuss it later on. It is a nerve loop basically. It is formed by C1, C2, C3, part of the cervical plexus. And the main function of this nerve loop is supplying the infrahyoid muscles. Action of sternohyoid is, because sternum is below the hyoid bone, so it will, the point of origin is pulling the point of insertion towards it, so it is depressing the hyoid bone. In this figure you can see the origin of sternohyoid is from the manubrium sterni. So this is the origin point and it takes origin from the posterior surface of the manubrium sterni. From the anterior surface you have the sternocleidomastoid, that is the sternal head of the sternocleidomastoid takes origin from the anterior surface of the manubrium sterni. From the posterior surface you have the sternohyoid muscle, and it also takes origin from this adjoining part of the clavicle. And also there is a ligament between the sternum and the clavicle, that is the sternoclavicular ligament, also from the posterior part of that ligament. These are the origin point. Finally it gets inserted into the hyoid bone, that is medial part of the lower border. It gets inserted into the inferior border, medial part, and the action is it will pull hyoid bone towards sternum, that is it will depress the hyoid bone. Second muscle in the infrahyoid group is the sternothyroid muscle. Again, as the name suggests, taking origin from the manubrium sterni and getting inserted into the thyroid cartilage. So the first name is of the origin and the second name or the suffix is for the insertion. Nerve supply is again Ansa cervicalis and it depresses the larynx. Thyroid cartilage of course is part of the larynx, so it will depress the point of origin, again will pull the point of insertion towards it. So in this figure, this green muscle is the sternothyroid. The green muscle that you see is the sternothyroid muscle taking origin again from the manubrium sterni and getting inserted into the thyroid cartilage. This is the thyroid cartilage. So the origin of sternothyroid is from the posterior surface of the manubrium sterni and also this first costal cartilage. And this is the first costal cartilage on both sides. This also gives origin to the sternothyroid and it gets inserted into this thyroid cartilage, that is the oblique line on the lamina. This is the oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. So on this line the muscle gets inserted. So this point of insertion move towards the point of origin. So there is depression of the larynx when this muscle acts. Next muscle is the thyrohyoid muscle. So again, prefix is the origin, suffix is the insertion. Nerve supply is only C1 through the hypoglossal nerve. Action is depressing the hyoid bone, elevating the larynx. So this muscle here is the thyrohyoid. It is taking origin from the oblique line on the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. That is just opposite. This muscle is taking origin from here and it goes and gets inserted into the hyoid bone above. That is the lower border of the hyoid bone and also from the greater cornua. Action is point of origin, pulling the point of insertion towards it, so it will depress the hyoid bone, and it also elevates the larynx. Next muscle is the omohyoid muscle. So omohyoid muscle basically consists of two bellies. One is the inferior belly, another is the superior belly. So in this muscle, the origin is with the help of the inferior belly. So the inferior belly is taking origin from the scapula bone. This is the bone, this is the glenoid cavity, this is coracoid process, this is scapula basically. So from the suprascapular notch, which is present here on the superior border, this muscle is taking origin, the inferior belly is taking origin, and insertion of this muscle takes place with the help of superior belly. So the superior belly gets inserted into the hyoid bone, this is the hyoid bone, into the lower border of the body of the hyoid bone. So this is superior belly, this is inferior belly. In between two, there is a common tendon that unites them. The nerve supply of the muscle is by Ansa cervicalis. There are two roots of the Ansa cervicalis. So the superior root supplies the superior belly and the inferior root supplies the inferior belly. This muscle also depresses the hyoid bone. That is the point of origin, pulls the point of insertion towards it. So that's all about the origin, insertion, nerve supply and action of the infrahyoid group of muscles, which forms the muscular triangle, also the content of the muscular triangle and the floor of the muscular triangle. Now we'll discuss a little bit about the Ansa cervicalis. So it is a nerve loop. You can see here this C1, C2 and C3, they form a loop, and this loop is referred to as the Ansa cervicalis. And the C1, C2, C3, they are part of the cervical plexus. This loop, this Ansa cervicalis, it lies superficial to the internal jugular vein in the carotid triangle. The main function of this loop is the branches from this Ansa cervicalis innervate the infrahyoid muscles. And this Ansa cervicalis, basically the meaning of this is handle of the neck. There are two roots of Ansa cervicalis. First is the superior root here, which takes origin, or it is formed from the C1 nerve of the cervical plexus. Fibers from this travel, reach the hypoglossal nerve here, and then they separate and they form the superior root in the carotid triangle. Similarly, there is a inferior root. Inferior root is formed, it is also known as descendens cervicalis. It is formed from the C2 and C3. And the inferior root supplies the inferior belly of omohyoid muscle and also the lower part of the sternothyroid and sternohyoid muscle. And the superior root gives branches to the superior belly of omohyoid and also upper parts of the sternothyroid and sternohyoid muscle. So that's all about the remaining portion of the anterior triangle of neck. Thank you so much.